Where to even begin with this one? Whether you're talking about the Star Wars prequel trilogy, the sequel trilogy, Disney Plus, or anything else that isn't the original trilogy, really, there always seems to be a group of people that doesn't like them. However, this is more justified in certain cases than others, specifically when it comes to the prequel and sequel trilogies. Because if you know anything on the subject, then you're already well aware that while the prequels were generally regarded as, shall we say, subpar films, many have warmed up to them over time for varying reasons and have even celebrated the return of actors and characters from that era, while the sequel trilogy remains just as hated and divisive even years after its release. And today, I'd like to explore why that is. Why do the Star Wars prequels get less hate these days than the sequel trilogy does? And obviously, spoilers for anything and everything Star Wars may abound, at least on the movie side of things. So in case you aren't all caught up, you might want to come back to this video later. I will be giving out no other spoiler warnings here. Okay, now I know I'm far from the first person to make a video covering this topic, and that it would be pretty easy for me to just repeat the same old talking points. However, I would instead like to start off this analysis looking at these two trilogies from a different angle, specifically foundations. You see, a story, just like anything else, needs to have a good basis or starting point, otherwise the whole thing is doomed to collapse from the start. For example, as I covered in my video on why parody movies are usually bad, and you can find a link to that in the description, comedies that are conceived or built on a single joke or concept usually don't turn out too well, because the foundation for the story is one that simply doesn't have the strength or weight to carry it out to movie length, among other issues, such as if the joke is even funny in the first place. But this doesn't apply just to comedy either. This applies to all forms of storytelling. I even remember from my days of writing books that I sometimes would have a good idea for a story, but ended up having to scrap it when I realized that this one idea just wasn't enough to carry an entire story, no matter how good the idea actually was on its own. If a story doesn't have a good foundation, then it will inevitably come apart. And to make this slightly easier to understand, think of a movie as a house, and the idea behind the movie is the foundation. See, there's that word again. The point is, if a house is built on a bad foundation, it will either end up collapsing at worst or suffer from severe problems that usually take years of extra maintenance to fix at best. When built on a good foundation or idea, then it either paves the way for some of the greatest stories ever told, or things go wrong in the actual building of the house, or the writing and or directing of the movie. And the latter is what happened to the prequels. You see, the prequels had an excellent foundation to build off of, because George Lucas had great ideas for his stories. The problem was that he didn't know how to execute them properly, which is what led to most of the problems you see in those movies. Or to go back to the analogy, he had the perfect foundation to build his main house on, but messed up in the actual construction of the house. But as things like the Clone Wars TV series proved, the foundation or fundamental idea behind those movies was a very good and solid one, with plenty of potential to tell great stories, provided the right people were there to help Lucas execute his ideas. Or, with people helping him, Lucas was able to build smaller houses on his foundation that proved almost perfectly stable and fit to live in when he had a little help. Alright, getting away from that for a second, the point is that the prequels had a great starting point or idea behind them, and it was only Lucas's problems translating that idea on screen that led to the problems with those movies. But the concept itself is a good one, and I think that's a major reason why people have let up on them since their release. Because they've had time to look past the movie's superficial flaws to realize that there was actually a pretty good story behind it all, and can appreciate that story even with its flaws in execution. And again, the Clone Wars TV series coming out when it did only helped to reinforce this fact. Now contrast this with the sequels. And considering they had absolutely no plan for them and were being written by people who didn't have the greatest understanding of Star Wars, the foundation was already broken from the start. In fact, one could argue that there wasn't even an idea behind those movies beyond how do we continue this story? And the result was 3 movies that not only didn't connect to the rest of the story, but didn't even connect to each other. To put it simply, these 3 movies don't even work as a trilogy. There's no consistent story. The themes are all over the place, and they contradict their fellow movies as they please. And this only applies even more so to the movies they're claiming to be sequels to. Their connection to the previous 2 trilogies are basically non-existent beyond a few characters that act suspiciously different and some subtle and not so subtle references to them. To put it another way, and going back to that analogy, the sequel trilogy is built on a foundation that is so broken the whole house falls apart and in on itself before it can even be finished, and no amount of maintenance and rebuilding can ever fix that. So what looks like much better movies are actually just that, all style and no substance. The story is broken, nothing makes any sense, and doesn't continue the story of the previous 2 trilogies in any meaningful way. In other words, the sequels messed up the story a lot more than the prequels ever did. The prequels at least had a story to tell. The sequel trilogy only had seats to fill. And even in that, it ended up doing more harm than good. And what is the main reason for this? Well, I would mainly put it down to passion. Because even if George Lucas isn't the best storyteller, one can't deny that he cared about the story he was trying to tell, and tried to make it the best it could be in spite of himself. And it was that story that allowed the movies to have a great foundation, or the fundamental ideas, if not the execution. In other words, the prequels feel like they connect to the original trilogy. It's at least believable that it's all the same story, and ends up telling a pretty grim tale of how the galaxy got to the state it was in by A New Hope. The sequel trilogy, however, didn't have that same regard and seemed to instead believe that they could do the story better than Lucas rather than stay true to how he would have done it, while at the same time really only being concerned with how much money there was to be made. And the proof of this simply lies in something I didn't even pick up on until it was pointed out to me: the actors' performances. Because even if the actors in the sequel trilogy are superficially better, there's a certain energy from the actors in the prequels that they just don't have. Basically, if you watch the prequels, you never get the feeling that the actors don't want to be there. Especially if you watch the behind the scenes footage, you can see how much fun these guys are having and how dedicated they are to their parts. Seriously, Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen learned their whole duel in Revenge of the Sith themselves. No doubles were used. And note that this was after Christensen had already been bashed and ridiculed to no end for his performance in Attack of the Clones, and he was still that committed to it. And I believe this mainly comes down to both George Lucas's passion and enthusiasm for the movies he was making spilling over into everyone else, as well as the actors' own passion and love for Star Wars and their belief that they were a part of something worth being a part of, if not always handled the best. In other words, I believe everybody there already had a lot of passion for Star Wars, and Lucas's presence not only made for a fun working environment, but one that encouraged them to express that on screen and enjoy themselves. But the sequels, by contrast, have none of this enthusiasm. Sure, at first it feels like the actors are at least trying to have fun and make it worthwhile, but by the third movie it's so obvious they've given up that they might as well turn to the screen and say, "I'm just here out of contractual obligations and a paycheck." The energy, the enthusiasm, it's just gone. Really, other than possibly Adam Driver, the only ones that feel like they're putting any genuine effort into it is the actors from the previous trilogies. And that's obviously because they've already had over 40 years to grow fond of their characters and want to have justice done to them no matter what. Just take a look at the movie's most infamous line, "Somehow, Palpatine returned." I'd guarantee you that is not Oscar Isaac acting in his despair. It is so obvious he is wishing they just killed him off, because not only does he know he's in a bad movie, but it's not any fun for him to be a part of either. I'd guarantee you the production of that movie in particular was extremely stressful with a lot of pressure being put on everybody. And just look at what he and John Boyega said about the trilogy after the fact. It's clear that there was no passion or even genuine storytelling being put into any of those movies. Okay, so to backtrack a bit, I would say that a major reason the prequels have started to get more leeway than the sequel trilogy comes down to their foundations, or most core ideas. Because George Lucas at least had a story to tell that he actually cared about, and even if he somewhat botched it, the movies can still be appreciated for what he was trying to do. The sequels, by contrast, really don't have anything to offer in terms of story, passion, or even as a continuation. As I said before, the problem basically boils down to the fact that the flaws of the prequel trilogy can easily be fixed, as the Clone Wars TV series beautifully showed. The sequel's flaws, however, are on a fundamental level and broken so deeply that no amount of Clone Wars style shows could ever fix them or help them to make sense. In other words, the prequel's saving grace was that George Lucas actually cared and put a lot of thought into what he was trying to create. The sequels, on the other hand, were just thrown together without much passion for Star Wars. And the results, both as movies and how the fans view them, honestly speak for themselves. Alright, that's about everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the fundamental difference between the Star Wars prequels and sequels comes down to the foundations they were built on and how much passion was put into them? Or do you believe it's for entirely different reasons they have the reputations that they do? Please let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, you are entitled to your own opinions on this matter. You can love or hate either the prequels and the sequels, and you can think I'm dead wrong if you want. You don't have to agree with me just because you watched this video. And finally, thank you all for watching. It is very greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.